Leo had never imagined his life would turn out like this. It was supposed to be the life they dreamed of, him, Isabella, and their little boy Aiden. But somewhere along the way, the fairy tale slipped through his fingers. It started innocently enough, like any relationship on the edge of something beautiful. They had their ups and downs, but that's marriage, right? The way life works, right? But there's something about the slow realization that your partner is slipping away that cuts deeper than anything else. The first sign. She stopped picking up the phone when he called. Every time he reached out, Isabella seemed too busy for him. And then, one night, Leo saw it, on her social media feed. A picture of Isabella, her ex, Nick, and their son Aiden, together, smiling like the perfect family. Perfectly posed, perfectly framed, perfectly. Everything. But Leo wasn't in that picture. He wasn't even in her life anymore. A wave of loneliness hit him like a freight train, suffocating him in that moment. Isabella had been so cold, so distant. She brushed him off with those tired, rehearsed words, "I'm busy," followed by another update with her ex. It was almost as if she was flaunting it, like she was rubbing salt in the wound, and the worst part. She didn't seem to care. But Leo was falling apart. He'd been at home, alone, overwhelmed by pain, both physical and emotional, trying to push through the darkness, swallowing more than just the bitter pills prescribed to him. A dangerous mix of medication and whiskey sent him spiraling, almost taking him out of the world entirely. The thought of losing his family, his life, pushed him to the edge. But somehow, in the haze, he fought through, found the strength to stand tall. When he woke up, the world was still spinning, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let her have the last word. Not like this. Not when he still had so much left to fight for. He printed the divorce papers. Isabella didn't believe it. She laughed, coldly, asking, "You think you can survive without me?" As if to say, "Who are you without me?" But Leo had made up his mind. He wasn't crawling back to her. He wasn't the man who would beg. She might have thought he was weak, that he'd crumble. But she didn't know him anymore. She might have had the perfect family, but Leo wasn't going to be part of her charade anymore. It was time for him to take back his life. And so, as Isabella and Aiden walked out the door that night, Leo made the hardest decision of his life: he wouldn't look back. Not this time. The house felt emptier now, like a shell of the home it once was. Leo had lived here with Isabella for years. They had built memories, raised Aiden together, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. But now, it was just him, alone, surrounded by the remnants of what once was. The divorce papers were signed. The words on the page didn't make things any easier, but they did bring a strange sense of finality. Isabella was gone. She had moved on, seemingly without a second thought. But Leo? He was still haunted by the memories, by the love he once had and thought would last forever. It wasn't easy letting go of something that had shaped him for so long. He spent the days in a haze. Sometimes, he couldn't even remember if it was morning or night. The once familiar rhythm of their life, meals together, bedtime stories with Aiden, was now just a painful echo in his mind. He tried to distract himself. He found comfort in simple things, like the routine of his morning coffee, or the quiet walks around the block. But the pain was always there, like a shadow, creeping in every time he let his guard down. And the loneliness. That was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of Isabella. It was the absence of everything they had built. Leo could still hear her voice in his head, still see the way she looked at him when they were happy. He remembered the laughter, the silly moments with Aiden, and the plans they made for the future. But all of that was gone now. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take another step, he found himself looking back. Not at the past with regret, but at the possibility of a future without her. It was strange. For years, he had let himself believe that she was the center of his world. But now, as the days passed and the pain started to dull just a little, he realized something. He was still here. He was still breathing. He was still living. There were moments when he found himself staring out the window, wondering what his life would look like if he truly let go of the past. Would he ever be happy again? Would he ever be whole? The truth was, Leo didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to start asking the right questions. Could he forgive himself for what had happened? Could he find peace in the silence, even if it felt like 1,000 things were left unsaid? And most importantly, could he move forward, even though the past seemed to pull him back at every turn? He didn't have the answers yet, but Leo knew one thing: he wasn't going to let the pain define him. The struggle within wasn't just about his marriage or Isabella's betrayal. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried for too long. It was about rediscovering who he was without the weight of his past holding him down. For the first time in a long time, Leo felt the spark of hope. And that, maybe, was the first step toward healing. Leo woke up, his body stiff, his mind clouded. It wasn't that he hadn't slept, it was just that the restlessness never left him. The nights were the hardest. During the day, he could keep himself distracted, watching the world pass by, filling his hours with meaningless tasks. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, everything became painfully clear. The silence in the house became deafening, and the weight of it all hit him like a wave. The divorce was official, but the grief. That was a slow burn. It didn't show up all at once, it came in waves, subtle at first, like a storm on the horizon. One minute he was fine, the next he was flooded with memories of his son's laughter, Isabella's smile, and all the little moments that used to fill their home with life. Isabella had moved on. Leo could see it in her posts, her pictures with Nick, and her seemingly perfect life without him. She had a new chapter, while he was left to pick up the pieces of his broken heart. It hurt more than he cared to admit, and as much as he wanted to be strong, there were days when he couldn't stop the tears. He often found himself staring at the old photos of their family, the ones that used to bring him comfort. Now, they only served as a reminder of everything he had lost. Aiden's childhood, Isabella's touch, the love that seemed so certain and everlasting. Those were the things he couldn't get back. And the hardest part? Knowing that Aiden was growing up in a world where his father was no longer the center of his life. Leo had tried to reach out, tried to call his son, but each time he was met with silence. Aiden, the boy who used to look up to him, had grown distant. He wasn't sure if it was because of the separation, or if it was the influence of Isabella and her family, but the connection they once had was slipping away. Leo could feel it, like a thread being pulled until it snapped. One evening, he sat alone in the living room, staring at the TV that wasn't even on. His mind was racing, his heart aching with the weight of everything that had happened. The life he had known seemed so far away, like it belonged to someone else. He reached for the whiskey bottle, his old comfort. But tonight, it didn't work. It didn't dull the pain the way it used to. Mrs. Diaz, his caregiver, had noticed the change. She saw through his forced smiles, his attempts to appear fine. And she had tried to talk to him, but he always pushed her away. He wasn't ready to face it yet, not ready to admit that he was falling apart. But she spoke the truth, didn't she? A little spat between a couple was one thing, but letting it go on, letting the distance grow too wide, would eventually push Isabella away for good. Leo didn't want to hear it. But deep down, he knew she was right. His heart wasn't just broken from the divorce, it was from the life he had given up on. And he had to ask himself, was there still a chance to rebuild it? Or had the weight of the past crushed everything beyond repair? As the clock ticked on, Leo realized that the only way forward was through the pain. He didn't have the answers yet, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to face the truth about his life, and about what was left to fight for. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, a finality Leo had been avoiding for months. Isabella had come home late, and tonight was supposed to be the night. He had planned it all, every detail of how he would give her the divorce papers. In some ways it felt like a relief. But in others, it felt like the weight of 1,000 broken promises crashing down on him. He was sitting on the couch, the papers folded neatly in his hand. The room was dimly lit, the evening air heavy with unspoken words. When Isabella walked in, she barely glanced at him. She was tired, and from the look in her eyes, she was probably still wrapped up in her own world, her career, her new life, and whatever had been growing between her and Nick. The last thing on her mind was him. And maybe that was what stung the most. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, a bit too casually for Leo's liking. It was a long day. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, the woman he had once loved with every part of his being. The woman who had stood by him during the darkest moments of his life. She was still the same Isabella in many ways, yet, in other ways, she was a stranger. "I have something for you," Leo said, his voice unsteady but determined. "Something I need you to see." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't sit down. She knew something was coming, but she didn't expect this. Leo handed her the divorce papers. Isabella looked at them for a long moment, the silence between them stretching. "What's this?" she asked, her voice flat, though a small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. "It's the end," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep doing this anymore." Isabella scoffed, the smirk on her face fading into something colder. "You think you can just walk away from me? From this? You think you'll survive without me?" She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You're not serious. You can't be serious." Leo met her eyes, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the sting of her words. "I'm more serious than I've ever been," he said, his voice steady, a quiet strength he hadn't felt in a long time settling in his chest. Isabella didn't believe him. She tossed the papers on the table with a huff, standing up to walk toward the door. "Fine," she said, her tone cold. "If this is what you really want, then fine. But don't come crawling back to me when you realize you made a mistake." Leo didn't try to stop her. He didn't beg her to stay. He just watched as she left, as she walked out the door, and into the life she had already begun without him. He thought about the past, the years they'd spent together, the love they once shared, and he wondered if he had ever really known her. Maybe that was the hardest part, realizing that everything they had was built on a fragile foundation that had long since cracked. He looked down at the divorce papers in his hands. This was the moment he had feared for so long, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like freedom. A chance to breathe. A chance to find himself again. The divorce wasn't just the end of his marriage, it was the beginning of something new. Something he had to find on his own. The mornings were the hardest. Leo woke up to the quiet emptiness of the house, the kind of silence that reminded him of everything that had been lost. Isabella wasn't there. Aiden wasn't there. The life he once had, filled with noise, laughter, and the chaos of family, now felt like a distant memory. He tried to ignore the loneliness, to push it away like it was just another thing he could control. But it crept in during the quiet moments, those moments when the house felt too big, the shadows in the corners too dark. It wasn't just the physical absence of them, it was the emotional space they'd left behind. A space that now felt hollow. But something had changed. He wasn't the man who had nearly given up on life a few months ago. He wasn't the man who had lain in a bathtub, drowning in self-pity and regret. Leo was different now, even if he wasn't entirely sure how or why. The divorce had brought pain, but it also brought clarity. For the first time, Leo was starting to understand that his healing was something only he could control. It wasn't about what Isabella had done or didn't do. It wasn't about Aiden pulling away, or the endless quiet of the house. It was about him, about finding a way to move forward, to build something new, even if it was just the smallest of steps. He found small comforts in the routine he was building for himself. Mornings began with a cup of coffee, the kind he used to share with Isabella, but now it was just him, savoring each sip as he watched the sunlight creep through the window. He made his way through the day with intention, forcing himself to get out of bed, to take walks in the neighborhood, to talk to Mrs. Peterson when she knocked on his door with her warm smile and even warmer dumplings. Mrs. Peterson had been a constant, a friendly face that had become a small part of his new normal. She dragged him to the bakery to work part-time, and though it wasn't exactly the dream job, it felt good to be needed. For the first time in months, Leo was beginning to feel like he had a purpose again. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. One evening, as he sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't exist. Maybe healing was about accepting what had happened, learning from it, and then moving forward. It was about finding peace with what was, and then discovering the strength to rebuild. The emotional scars would take time to fade. But they weren't as sharp anymore. They were no longer the defining feature of his life. Leo had learned to accept his imperfections, his broken body, his past mistakes, his flaws, and he was beginning to see them not as weaknesses, but as part of what made him who he was. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't whole yet. But he was on his way. And that was enough for now. It had been weeks since Leo moved into the small apartment, a place far from the family home he once shared with Isabella and Aiden. The apartment wasn't much, just a modest space with a single bedroom and a small kitchen. But to Leo, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could breathe again, without the weight of constant reminders that life used to be different. It was his first step toward real freedom, but also a painful one. The days were a blur of monotony. Work at the bakery kept him busy, but when the sun went down and the lights dimmed in his apartment, the silence swallowed him whole. He couldn't escape it. It lingered, following him even in his dreams, pulling him back to the moments that broke him. The memories of Isabella, the laughter they shared, the hopes they built together, haunted him in a way he hadn't expected. Leo knew that he couldn't continue living this way, forever looking back, forever feeling the weight of everything he'd lost. The only way forward was through the past, and that meant facing the painful truths he had buried deep within himself. One night, as he sat by the window, staring at the rain that fell in steady sheets, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Diaz. She'd become more than just a caregiver, she'd become a friend, someone who saw through the cracks in his armor. "You can't keep running from it, Leo," she said gently, her voice steady. "You need to face what happened, really face it, if you're ever going to move on." Leo let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. "I'm not sure I can, Mrs. Diaz. I don't know how to face it. Every time I try, it feels like I'm drowning." She was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "I know you think you've already faced it, left it behind with the divorce and the pain. But part of you is still holding on to the past, Leo. You have to let go, not just of Isabella, but of the idea of who you were before all of this. You have to face your own fears and doubts, your own mistakes. It stung, hearing the truth laid out so plainly. But she was right. Leo had spent so much time blaming Isabella, blaming his past, that he hadn't looked inward. The truth was, he had a part in it all. He had been so focused on surviving the pain, he had forgotten to live. Forgotten to see the man he was becoming, rather than the man he used to be. That night, Leo did something he hadn't done in a long time. He picked up the phone and called Isabella. The conversation was brief, awkward even, but it was enough. He didn't beg for her to come back, and he didn't ask for explanations. He just needed to hear her voice one last time, to let go of the bitterness that had festered for so long. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything. For what I did, for what we both did." For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. And then, softly, Isabella's voice came through. "I'm sorry, too." And in that quiet exchange, something shifted in Leo. He wasn't completely healed. The road ahead was still long. But he realized that sometimes, the hardest part isn't moving on, it's accepting the past, owning it, and learning to forgive, even when the hurt still lingers. The storm of emotions Leo had been battling privately was about to spill out into the open. It wasn't something he planned, it was more like a quiet eruption, a moment when everything that had been building up over the years had nowhere left to go but out. For the first time since the divorce, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The truth, the whole truth, was waiting to be told. Leo was sitting at his small kitchen table one afternoon, sipping his coffee when his phone buzzed. He picked it up, scrolling through the notifications, and froze. A video had surfaced. It was Jenna, a woman who had been through her own dark experience at the hands of Dr. Sutton, the same man who had nearly destroyed Leo's life during his rehab. Her video was raw, emotional, and devastatingly familiar. Jenna recounted her story of being assaulted by the doctor, just as Leo had been. The memories came rushing back, sharper than ever. But this time, it wasn't just his pain, it was hers too, and it seemed to fill the gaps in his heart. She was telling the world what had happened to her, and she wasn't alone anymore. Leo watched, captivated and horrified all at once, as Jenna poured out her story to the camera. She spoke of the shame, the fear, the guilt of not being believed. And in those words, Leo found his own voice, his own truth, dormant but still burning inside him. The thought of keeping quiet anymore felt impossible. As Jenna's video started to gain traction, Leo knew he couldn't just sit by. He had to speak up, too. His past had been buried under layers of pain and shame, but now, he realized that sharing his truth was the only way to reclaim the life he had lost. He took a deep breath and turned on his camera. For the first time, he began to speak, not just about the assault, but about everything that had happened. His marriage, his injuries, the way Isabella had changed, and the betrayal he felt. He told the world about Dr. Sutton, the man who had assaulted him during his rehab, and how no one had believed him. He spoke about Isabella, and how she had dismissed his pain, too consumed with her own life to see him as anything but a burden. "I've been silent for too long," Leo said, his voice shaking but strong. "But no more. I'm not hiding behind the shame anymore. I won't let anyone tell me my story doesn't matter." He uploaded the video. And just like that, everything changed. His words began to circulate online, and the response was overwhelming. Some people supported him, others mocked him, and many took to questioning his motives. But in the sea of opinions, there were those who stood by him, who understood the pain behind his words and shared their own stories of trauma and silence. The backlash wasn't easy to handle. He wasn't prepared for the judgment, the attacks, or the cruelty that would come his way. But what struck him the most was how freeing it felt. The truth was out. He had let go of the past that had clung to him like a second skin. As Leo watched the comments flood in, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about anyone who had suffered in silence, anyone who had been hurt and ignored. His story had become part of a bigger movement, one that was about giving people the courage to speak up, to demand justice, and to heal. For the first time in years, Leo felt a flicker of hope. He was no longer defined by his pain. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his life. Leo sat by his window, watching the rain fall in steady sheets, the kind that seemed to wash away everything in its path. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional car passing by, but in his apartment, it felt like the world had slowed down. His mind, however, was racing, caught in the storm of emotions he had been holding onto for so long. Isabella's life had moved on, just as his had. But now, it seemed like her world was beginning to crumble. After he exposed the truth, the fallout had been swift. News outlets were picking up the story, social media was ablaze with opinions, and the public had a lot to say. It wasn't just the divorce that was coming back to haunt Isabella. It was everything, the way she had handled their marriage, the way she had discarded him when he was most vulnerable. The backlash had been swift, but what hit hardest was how quickly the truth spread, the way it revealed the cracks in her carefully constructed life. Isabella's once successful career was now facing the consequences of her actions. The very public image she had worked so hard to cultivate, the devoted wife, the loving mother, was being called into question. People were now wondering how much of her public persona was genuine, and how much was a carefully crafted facade. For years, she had used Leo's pain to fuel her career, to build herself up. She was the woman who stood by her husband through the darkest of times, the supportive wife who never wavered. But Leo's truth had shattered that image. He wasn't the only one who had been hurt in their marriage. Isabella had built her empire on the back of his suffering, and now, the world was starting to see the cracks. It wasn't just her career that was suffering. The whispers about her relationship with Nick, about the affair that had started before their divorce was even finalized, had gone viral. The perfect family image she had projected with Aiden and Nick was being questioned, with many people calling out the hypocrisy of it all. Leo had to admit, a part of him felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching the pieces of her world fall apart. He'd spent so many years feeling small, ignored, and cast aside. Now, he could see that the consequences of her actions were finally catching up to her. And maybe, just maybe, this was a form of justice. But Leo wasn't someone who celebrated other people's suffering. He wasn't gloating or reveling in Isabella's downfall. Deep down, he knew that this was her battle to fight, not his. What mattered to him now was how he moved forward. He couldn't change what had happened, and he couldn't control the consequences she faced. All he could control was his own life. He had no illusions that life would suddenly be easy or that all his pain would vanish. But he was learning to embrace the idea that everything had a balance. For years, he had been the one hurt by betrayal, by lies, by a love that faded away. Now, the universe seemed to be righting the scales. Karma, as some people called it, was doing its work. But Leo knew that true healing didn't come from the suffering of others. It came from within. And so, as the rain poured down, Leo made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't be defined by the past or by the actions of those who hurt him. He was moving forward. The consequences of the past were not his burden to bear anymore. For the first time in months, Leo woke up without the weight of yesterday hanging over him. The silence in his apartment no longer felt suffocating. It had become a strange comfort, like the quiet of an empty house that once teemed with life. He'd finally learned to sit in it, to breathe through it, without feeling like he was drowning. The journey to this moment had been long. He had spent so many days looking back, trying to figure out where things went wrong, wondering if there was something he could have done to stop the pain. But now, standing in the middle of his new life, Leo realized something important. Moving on wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and choosing to walk forward. That morning, he didn't pick up the phone to check Isabella's social media, as he had done every day before. He didn't care about the rumors swirling around her, or the judgment people had passed. It wasn't his life anymore. He had his own life to live now. And the first step in that new life was letting go. Leo spent the day walking around the city, something he hadn't done in years. The sun was out, the streets bustling with people, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't hiding. He wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to pass judgment on him. He was simply existing in the world, taking it all in. He stopped by the bakery, where he worked part-time, just to check in and chat with Mrs. Peterson. She greeted him with her usual warmth, a reminder that, even in his darkest moments, he wasn't truly alone. He realized that these small interactions, these simple moments of connection, had become his anchor. As he left the bakery and walked down the street, something inside him shifted. It was as if he had finally turned the page. His past was still there, but it no longer had the power to control him. He had taken the lessons from his marriage, from the pain, and used them to grow. He wasn't the same man he had been when Isabella left. He was stronger now, more self-aware, and most importantly, he was at peace with who he had become. Later that night, Leo sat in his apartment, the same place that once felt so empty, but now felt like a sanctuary. He didn't feel the need to reach out to anyone, to explain himself, or to seek validation from the world. He had found something better, his own approval. He had come to understand that his worth didn't depend on anyone else's perception of him. The phone buzzed with a message from Aiden. It was a simple text, a picture of the little boy smiling with his mom and Nick. Leo couldn't help but smile, too. Aiden was growing up, finding his place in the world, and Leo was no longer a part of that world in the way he once was. But that was okay. What mattered now was that Leo was healing. Moving on didn't mean leaving the past behind. It meant finding a way to live with it, to let it shape you into someone better, and to embrace the possibility of new beginnings. Leo stood in front of his apartment window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky, a soft blend of pink and gold, reminded him of the way things once were, beautiful, yet fleeting. He had learned a lot over the past few months. The pain, the heartache, the betrayal, they were all pieces of the story, but not the whole story. He had come to realize that the hardest part of the journey wasn't moving on from the person who hurt you, it was letting go of the version of yourself that existed with them. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from Isabella. His heart didn't skip a beat like it once did, but he still felt a strange heaviness as he unlocked the screen. It had been weeks since they last spoke, but the words that followed didn't surprise him. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," her message read. "I know I messed up, and I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I never meant to hurt you. Do you ever think about us? About what we had?" Leo stared at the message for a long time, the weight of it settling in his chest. He had been the one to walk away, to stand firm in his decision, and yet, here she was, reaching out, asking for something he no longer had to give. He had spent so long chasing after her love, after her approval, after the life they had built together. But now, after all the pain, he realized that the love they once shared had become something different. It was no longer about what they had, it was about who he had become without her. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered his response. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. But he wasn't the man he used to be. The man who would have begged, the man who would have given everything to fix what was broken. He had learned something important, that true closure came from within. I think about us sometimes, Leo typed slowly, carefully choosing his words. But I've realized that we are not the same people we once were. We both changed. And that's okay. I've forgiven you, but I've also forgiven myself for staying too long when I wasn't happy. I'm moving forward, Isabella. I hope you can find peace with the choices you've made, just like I've had to. He stared at the screen for a moment, his fingers tingling with the urge to delete the message, to rewrite it, to somehow make it more gentle. But he didn't. This was the truth, and for once, he wasn't afraid to speak it. He hit send. The seconds ticked by before her reply came through. It was brief, but it didn't matter. I understand. Goodbye, Leo. And just like that, the chapter closed. Leo put the phone down, a quiet sense of finality washing over him. He had loved deeply, and he had been hurt beyond words, but he had also grown stronger, wiser, and more at peace than he'd ever been before. The road ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to walk it alone.